Okay, welcome to Preserving Cooper Bessemer's Rail History Part 2. This is going to be saving the steam locomotive tender trucks, shop flats and whirlies, and moving the GE 35 tonner. My name is Vinson Skibo and I work for CSX. I'm a locomotive engineer. This is my office. If you you were here for the first part, you remember that this is the window from the front of my office where I work all the live long day, and unlike what the song said, I'm out there all the live long night most of the time too. I work out of Newcastle. I go west out into the flatlands of Ohio, and I haul just about everything that you could think of just to make sure that your Amazon packages show up on your doorstep.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Yes, there was a nationwide strike that was just recently averted, at least temporarily anyhow. And like I said, we haul just about everything that you can imagine, and sometimes a few things you can't even imagine. Like these are actually windmill turbine blades. So we haul things, like I said, you can't even imagine, even things that help keep our nation safe. And you know what? I get to see more sunsets and more sunrises, sometimes even in the same shift, time and time again. And the whole time I'm out there, I got to keep an eye peeled for that guy who's trying to beat my train over the road crossing. Because you know, it's all about timing. He thinks he can get out there before I do. And you know what? Timing was everything, even for us, when this whole thing started out there in the hog yard last spring. And sometimes that timing was good, and it was really good for us, even though we did miss a few things, and we're going to try to look at all of that in this presentation. The first part is going to be saving steam locomotive tender trucks and shop flats. But first of all, what are steam locomotive tender trucks and what are shop flats? Well, shop flats are really railroad flat cars. And what we see here are a series of 5 flat cars. This is the last delivery that the Cooper Bessemer ever got in 1997 before they closed their doors. These are Ingersoll Rand compressors. Now, why they got them, I'm not really sure. But what we see here is a flat car, and this one is a specialty car that has bulkhead ends on it. And when a company receives a shipment like this, typically they have a small period of time in which they have to unload it. Today, it's typically 24 hours. They have to unload that shipment. Then the railroad wants that car back. If they don't get that car released back to them, the company that's getting the delivery suffers something called demurrage, which is a fee for holding on to that car because the railroad needs to put that car back into service. So typically what happens is companies like the Cooper Bessemer buy flat cars that are no longer needed in service by the railroads, and they're held captive within the factory grounds themselves because they no longer need to have brake riggings tested, brake shoes replaced as often, and there's not a lot of maintenance required on them. That way they can still have those. These are still the same Ingersoll Rand compressors sitting on top of them covered, and they could move them around the property without having to suffer the demurrage fees that they would if they kept those mainline flat cars. Okay, so we call them shop flats in this particular instance. Here are a couple shop flats a little bit later on, and these had been sitting out there with these large overhead cranes that were taken down from the factory on top of them. And this particular car had always caught my attention, and because it didn't appear to look like a flat car at all. To me, being a rail historian, and a lot of other rail historians always saw this as something a little different. We thought of it might be from a steam locomotive tender, a frame from a tender that might have been converted. Now here's a steam locomotive. We thought, personally, I thought it might have come from this Pittsburgh and Lake Erie type locomotive. And on a steam engine, you have 2 sections. You have the boiler section and you have a tender back here. Now in the boiler section you have the cab where the engineer and the fireman sit and operate the locomotive. Right here you have the firebox. This is where the fuel is burned in order to heat the water and turn it into steam. That steam then is sent through a valve inside a dome, and a steam dome, which is sent down into the pistons. The pistons then move back and forth, which move a main rod, which turn the wheels and of course then propel the locomotive and the train behind it down the tracks. Once that steam goes through the piston, it then is exhausted through the smoke box and out the stack to atmosphere. Now, as the fuel is consumed, the smoke from the coal, in this case, that also goes out the stack, but we need to replenish that fuel. That's carried in a semi-permanently coupled car called a tender. Inside a bunker here is the coal, and that coal is then fed back into the firebox. Everybody thinks the fireman shovels that coal in there. These machines are too hungry for that type much coal. Two men could not shovel enough coal for that. There's actually a corkscrew type mechanism called a stoker that feeds it into the firebox here. Also back in here is a tank of water, and that water is also fed up through a pipe into a device called an injector. And as the steam is evacuated, we need to replenish the water, and that water comes from the tank into the boiler to change into steam. So now our tender supplies the fuel. It sits on top of a frame, and underneath the frame we have two assemblies called trucks, which are the wheels. We have one in the front here and one in the back here. So now we know what tender trucks are. There are these assemblies right here. So now, as I said, I has always thought that perhaps the shop flat that was out there in the hog yard was from a Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Mikado tender frame. When I compare the two photos, here's the photo that I took, and here is one from my collection. They look a lot alike, don't they? Okay. These little devices right here are called lift rings. There's one on each corner. Just in case it would go have a wreck or a derailment, you can hook a crane hook onto the end to lift it up, to put it back on the tracks. We can see the frame length, and we can see these little doors on here. These are covers for the bearings. They look almost identical, don't they? Okay. So you can see how I thought it might be this particular type of locomotive. Other folks thought it might have come from a New York Central Mikado. New York Central and Pittsburgh and Lake Erie were both from the same family of railroads, while others thought it might have come from a Hudson class locomotive from the New York Central. These type of locomotives are the kind that pulled the famous 20th Century Limited. Now, before we go too much further, I want to talk just a little bit about wheel arrangements and names, because we're going to be seeing a little bit about that. These are two types of locomotives, a Consolidation and a Pacific, that were very common in the early 1900s. Consolidations were common freight locomotives. Pacifics were common passenger service locomotives. And what we see here is what they call a 280. In the front we had a little pilot wheel, which is behind the pilot right here. Sometimes these are called cow catchers. You know, in all my days in studying railroad history and seeing photographs, I've never seen one of these things catch a cow. Well, why they come up with that name, sometimes I have to wonder. But we're looking at the left side of the fireman's side. So you have one wheel on each side, which is the 2, separated by a dash. This wheel helps support the pistons. And then we had 4 wheels on either side, which were the driving wheels. And in this particular case, underneath the firebox, we had no wheels, or an O, a 280. These were called consolidations. The Pacifics, we had 2 wheels on either side, 4 wheels total, separated by a hyphen, 6 driving wheels, and a trailing truck or a pony truck supporting the weight of the firebox. A 462 was a Pacific. If any of you are familiar with this photograph of a passenger train in front of the Grove City Station, the Bessemer and Lake Erie also used Pacific-type locomotives for their passenger trains during the steam locomotive era. So when we look at wheel arrangements, the things that you're going to be hearing a lot about in this presentation are Mikados. These were 282 wheel arrangements. These were used on the Bessemer and the New York Central. Mountains, or on the New York Central they called them Mohawks. These were 482 wheel arrangements. And of course on the Bessemer and Lake Erie we saw 210-4 wheel arrangements. These were very large. Now you're thinking, well, New York Central, we knew the Bessemer went through town, but the New York Central, they couldn't have been anywhere around here. On the contrary, the New York Central was in a lot of areas that you would not expect. And especially their Mikado class and their Mohawk classes were used a lot between Youngstown and Ashtabula, between Youngstown and the Shenango Valley, and from Ashtabula down into Stoneboro and Sandy Lake. through up into Franklin, across Belmar Bridge, and on into Clearfield and across Pennsylvania. Now, everybody might be familiar with Texans through the town here. This is actually a Texan. One of these has been saved for a museum and for posterity's sake. We're going to be looking at this and a little bit closer later on. As a matter of fact, one of our guests here tonight has a T-shirt with one of these locomotives on it. So everybody take a good look at him a little bit later on. Okay, so now we know what a shop flat is. Here's 3 shop flats, and we know what tender trucks are. So I've been keeping an eye on these things over in the hog yard for quite a few years, starting back in 2013. Every time I'd go by, if I saw them, I'd photograph them as time went on, and kept a close eye on them, especially if it was a nice blue sky day out there. And then one day last year, at the beginning of the year, all of a sudden those overhead cranes that were sitting on top of the frames were gone. They were off, so I knew something was afoot. Something was happening, but I wasn't sure what. I took a few pictures and I had to talk to somebody. I had to let some people know what was going on, or at least inquire to find out. So of course I got on the old internet, I sent that picture out, and one of the first guys I talked to was my friend Mike Schley here from town. Mike, of course, was a former Cooper Bessemer employee and former GE employee, but he's also a very talented, a very well-known rail historian. Also, I got a hold of Nathan Clark, who's also a rail historian. He's a former Conrail employee, and he escorts large railroad loads across the country. I also sent to 2 other individuals, Ray Grabowski from the Lakeshore Railway Historical Society. Ray had been inquiring about the whereabouts of the switcher, the locomotive, from inside the factory here recently, up to this point, and also to David McKay, from the president of the New York Central System Historical Society, since we already had an idea that this frame may have been from a New York Central steam locomotive. Well, I got some information back almost right away from Thomas Gerbroch from the New York Central Historical Society. My email was passed along to him. Tom is a noted historian who just released 2 books on Mohawk class locomotives. He is also a retired General Electric employee from Erie. You see him here with some of his models for the Mohawk class locomotives. He suggested that perhaps it was from a Mohawk class locomotive, one of the earlier ones built by Lima Locomotive Works, perhaps as early as the 1918 or so. And we could see the trucks in the frame here. There's our little lift ring right there. So he suggested that if we have an opportunity to gain access to the property, that we see if we can find any information, whether it was built by the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, or the Lima Locomotive Company, Lima. If we could find a builder date, and if we could find a tag that would have a serial number, a T followed by 4 digits. He suggested that we measure the frame between the buffer and the striker plate. That's the length of the frame across the middle. It should be 40.5 inches long. Nate also got back to me, and of course he picked up the phone, made some phone calls, and found out that all of the material in the hog yard was sold for scrap. It was owned at this point by a scrap dealer, and within the next few days everything was going to be cut up. So if we were going to do anything, we had to act fast. The scrap dealer was willing to sell it for just a mere $9,500. Hey, okay, well, at least we had some numbers. And however, we would still have to take care of transportation and storage fees. So here's the hog yard. This photo is, of course, from the Historical Society's collection here. And this is where the shop flat was located. And here's Madison Avenue right through here. Everybody's familiar with that. And so we had 3 things that we needed to satisfy. We had, first of all, to find the financial end of it. Somebody needed to come up with $9,500. We also needed the transportation and storage of the device and the financial part of that as well, and also the rationale. Who would want this thing, and why would they want it? Well, Renee and I live over here. Okay, so we're not that far away. And I figured, well, let's see, we live over here. The credit union is somewhere over this way, A couple credit cards maxed out. You see where I'm going with this? I got that one figured out. Okay, check. That one's good. And let's see, transportation and storage. Well, let's see, left-hand turn, a right-hand turn, another right-hand turn into the alley. I could borrow the neighbor's chainsaw, cut down the privacy fence. Okay, check, I got that one covered too. Now, the rationale. Somehow I had to convince Renee that 100-year-old steam engine tender frame sinking into the backyard was a good thing. Okay. Well, yes, that wasn't going to work. So we were kind of back to square one. We still had these things to contend with, but we did have permission to gain access to the property. So on Friday, May 28th, almost the very next day, we were able to get on board there. I had other obligations that morning, but Nate was able to get onto the property. And Nate, sitting up front here with us tonight, I'm glad that he was able to attend. And he took this picture here. They actually had to start cutting, they took off the decking off the top. This is all this pile of wood laying here, so that they could start cutting the brake rigging and everything else off of the connections in order to get the frame off of the trucks. And the trucks were lifted off of the rails that were that it had been sitting on for quite a while. I got there around lunchtime and it had been raining. It started to rain, and so we immediately started to take as many photos as we could in order to document as much as we could, because at this point in time we had no clue as to what we could save. And one of the things we saw right away was number one. What we learned right away was this was actually Cooper Bessemer car number 1, as they had logged it and called it. A couple other things we saw right away was we did find a serial number, a T-814. Did not have the 4 digits as we had been told to look for. It only had 3. So this had been something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. There again on the other end, on the striker plate, it was number 1. This was the end that was connected to the steam engine boiler section. It had been modified in order to have a coupler on it rather than a drawbar. This was a plate that had patent dates on it. It had been rusted so much it was right into the frame of the tender frame, right into it. There were other little tags that had numbers. We could not make heads or tails of them to a certain point. So we just documented as much as we could on this thing. We also found that there was a cylinder on there. At first we weren't sure if this was the steam cylinder that would lower the scoop. There was a water scoop on the middle of it that would drop down to scoop water into the tank while this thing was traveling at 70 miles an hour. Okay, or we weren't sure if this was the brake cylinder that would be used to stop this thing when it was going in excess of 70 miles an hour. So we took the numbers off of this, and we would check that when I got home. All right, so there it was. There was the frame. We did as much as we could to look over that. We started to investigate a little bit more on the trucks. They were in pretty good shape. Some of the bearing covers were missing. You could see the actual bearing in here. These were old friction bearings. They had to have these covers on them. They had to be packed with grease on a regular basis. We saw this is the saddle in here. This is where the frame actually sat. And these are called side bearings. These are actually little blocks that fit in here. And this keeps the frame and the tender from tipping side to side as it goes down the track. And as we started to look a little closer on this, we found right here, NYC, New York Central. So we did confirm that it was a New York Central frame, and it was dated 6/24/1924. This was not a builder date. This was a casting date for the frame of the trucks. So it was built slightly after this. This was an actual casting date. As we looked at the trucks, there was still a lot of debris on them, but they were in pretty good shape. And a lot of this type of stuff that we see here with these connections and all of this here is all part of the brake rigging assembly. All of this is brake rigging, a very, very complicated and intricate setup. The other truck also had a 1924 casting date, but the 6 was pretty well worn off of that. But we were confident that they were both the same. Also in the background, we saw that some of the other shop flats that had been sitting in the hog yard had already been dismantled and the flats themselves had been shipped off. We took a closer look at the trucks that we see here. This is a 3-axle truck. There were a pair of them sitting on there. And when I did a little research, I found that these were actually United States Army Transportation Corps trucks. The flat car was a 100-ton car that was designed to haul 2 M48 Patton tanks. So this put this particular flat car at the Korean War era. And here it is here in 2014 with one of the overhead cranes sitting on it. And again in 2015 over here. Next to it is a Milwaukee Road, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific car. The trucks were also sitting along next to them. And they were also dated and marked, but the dates on here put them a little earlier as a Second World War era. There were other trucks laying on the ground. These were much earlier. They were all marked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. They were all 1915 and 1916. They also appear to be possibly from a Pennsylvania Railroad steam locomotive tender frame. However, I've been unable to verify that at any point in time. Any one of these trucks or flat cars would have been more than welcome by any railroad museum if we would have known early enough in time to be able to make the connections to secure some type of donation of them. Unfortunately, they were gone. So we were faced with the same 3 questions. Who are we going to call? Nate and I discussed this to a great extent over a period of time throughout the day. And when we really came down to it, and sorted through the process of elimination, we came up with the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio. They filled the bill for all 3 of those questions. And one primarily was because they had recently purchased the Bessemer Lake Erie Texan. This is one of 2 steam locomotives from the Bessemer Lake Erie that was saved at the end of the reign of the steam by the Bessemer Lake Erie. They had 3 steam engines up in Greenville. One was the Union Railroad steam engine, which is in Greenville. The second, which is a consolidation type, it is at the Henry Ford Museum. And of course, there's this locomotive here. It was purchased from the U.S. Steel by a gentleman by the name of Glenn Campbell. And no, not that Glenn Campbell. Okay, there was another gentleman from Glenn Campbell who purchased it years ago and actually restored it. And it was at one point in a beautiful condition. It was runnable, and cosmetically it was gorgeous. Unfortunately, he restored it at a period of time when the insurance rates for running large steam locomotives on Class 1 railroads went through the roof. And it was just impractical to see this thing operate at that time. So it sat idle. He removed the bell, marker lights, anything that was vandalizable, let's call it, and kept them in a safe place. So they acquired this locomotive. So Nate got on the phone and called the folks down there at the Age of Steam to let them know that these trucks were in existence and they were available, and asked if they would be interested. And that is him actually on the phone calling them at this particular juncture. This isn't a stage photo. He's actually doing it in this particular picture. Okay. So the day came to an end, and what we found out was that we did have a date, or we did have the manufacturer. We did have the date. Even though it wasn't a builder date, we had a casting date, so we kind of knew about when it was manufactured. We had a serial number, not 4 digits, but 3. Okay. And we also had a length across the frame to the buffer plate. Now this particular end here, even though our length was a foot shorter, I'm going to say that this was a win, because when this was converted from a steam engine purpose to a shop flat purpose, this whole end was severely ground down and chopped off. So it probably lost about a foot in that particular process in order for it to be changed from a drawbar, solid bar, into a coupling device here. So I'm going to consider that was a win. Okay, so we really only did not know for a fact that if it came from a Mohawk, for sure if it was from a Lima or an Elko, and the serial number was still kind of questionable if it was a replacement or what. Now Memorial Day weekend came, everything kind of came to a halt. So everybody had other things to do, which was fine. Tuesday morning started off right away, and it was going to be a busy day. We did not know about the frame, and the frame was still kind of questionable, and they had to cut the frame. The frame was flipped over. The folks got to work there from DCI, and we can see here that the frame had to be cut right across here. It came off right here. Okay, this was so that they could actually put it on a flatbed truck to get it shipped off to the smelter. Also at that time, we saw that a tractor was backed onto the trailer in order to ship the other trucks from the shop flats out to down to the smelter, also to get those into recycling. But this exposed the cylinder, and we were able to determine that this was for the braking system. We examined that quite intensely at this point, and we saw that some of the brake rigging was still there as well, right in through here, and in the back of it also. We made a determination at this point that if anybody was going to acquire these wheels, that they were going to need to stop this thing. Now, modern railroad trucks have small brake cylinders attached right onto the trucks. However, this was not modern. This was old school. And if they were going to acquire these trucks, they were going to need to stop them at some point in time if they were going to use them. So we decided that maybe perhaps we would then need to save that as well. So this gave us a chance to make a few more observations. And right here in the part that we consider this the saddle, this is where the truck assembly would sit on. We also found some markings on here as well, that this was to also New York Central. And the badge here for our serial number, even though it was already tore, it broke apart, but I was able to pull that off and keep that as well for posterity's sake. There's Nate checking out the spot where the car had sat for so many years. And he also then got on the phone with the Age of Steam people again, using his skills from being a railroad salesman for so many years in the past. He basically said to them, look, where else are you going to find 100-year-old steam engine trucks from a Mohawk steam locomotive in today's day and age, just come out of nowhere? And he basically then convinced them to go ahead and pull the trigger and say, yes, we will buy them. And so that was a bit of a win for us at that particular point. Later on that day, he got to go inside, and he did find the 35-ton switcher that was hidden in the factory for so long. It had been stored off the rails, and it was pushed up against a wall inside the building. It was built by General Electric, and we had found that the prime mover, or the engine block, had been replaced. But the replacement never worked. For some reason or another, to this day we still don't know why, it does not work. And so it had been stored off the rails. They had used another engine as a rental, basically, from the point in time when they replaced this till the factory closed. And so this engine had just basically sat in storage inside the factory.
And what time was it stored? What year had it been stored?
I don't know when this was replaced, to be honest with you.
Okay, thanks.
That I can ask. Mike, do you happen to know when they changed this out?
Well, not exactly. But,
No. No.
It was running after we closed in '96.
This was?
That's what we learned, yeah.
Okay.
And that it actually seized for some reason. The engine seized.
Did they call that Dinky over there in the hog yard?
I believe that was a nickname.
The
Yeah.
Dinky. Okay.
Okay.
The Dinky.
Well, this was not part of the scrap deal, and Mr. Noon over there would consider this for possible donation. So basically all this information was passed along to Ray Grabowski up at the Lakeshore Railway Historical Society, and all of that information that he now was in his hands, and he started negotiations with Tom Noon to acquire the locomotive for their museum up in Northeast. So the next day came along, and this was going to be a busy day. So the first thing we did is we removed a lot of the pins out of the brake rigging assembly so that we can then release the brake cylinder and to get it started. The folks from DCI were just wonderful. Sam and his crew were just great, at working hard at getting that brake cylinder off of the frame. That thing was on there for almost 100 years, and it took a lot of work to get that thing freed. A lot of leverage involved, a lot of torching, you know, a lot of manpower, and finally, even once Sam got involved and got one hand on a handle there, that whole thing just broke right free. And so once that was free, one of the other fellows there's Nate asked him, could you get that plate free for us there too? And so he went to work on pulling out that truss plate, which is actually laying on the table up here, so you can look at it later on the way out. Just watch, there are some sharp edges on there. And so while he was torching away at that, they went ahead and started to move the brake cylinder up into the air and get it out of the way. Just about then, the Canadian National sent a high rail inspection vehicle right up along the track, so you can see how close it was there. Nate made sure that it was out of the way nice and safe. Nate, you said this weighed about 850 pounds or so?
Yeah, it seemed to, well, let's put it this way, I'm glad I didn't throw it over my shoulder and try and carry it.
Yeah. Okay, and so he was almost through cutting on that plate, a little swing with a 20-pound sledgehammer, and it was free finally. And whoops, do I watch picking it up? It was still hot even through the glove. And there it is. The first date on it was 1904. The last patent date on it was 1907. And that's part of Nate's collection there now. They had to move the brake rigging assembly over and finally got it out of the way. And I'll tell you what, that was a lot of hard work. It even wore out the youngest of men. But you know, like any good young man, a hard-working young man, he bounced back right away, and he was ready for some more. So I took a little break for lunch, and when I came back, they had already loaded the frame onto the truck, and were getting ready to get it shipped out of there. Just then, a northbound Canadian National train came by, and it was almost ironic because these are actually the two oldest locomotives running right now on the line. This is a former Duluth Mesabian Iron Range engine and a former Bessemer Lake Erie engine still in the Bessemer Lake Erie paint scheme. Either it was like a salute that they were going by saying, okay, we'll see you, old friend, or in a way saying, you know, wait up for us, we won't be long, no, we'll see you at the big roundhouse in the sky here before too long. And so they chained everything down and they were ready to go. And off to West Mifflin, I believe, they were going to send this off to get melted down into other things. And so now, finally, since 1950, that frame was on the property and it was finally laid. And away it went. On the final day, was the day that we were going to have all the lifts of the trucks themselves. So when I got there, Nate was already sweeping debris off the trucks. You know, we still had a lot of that decking on there and a lot of other things. We wanted to make sure everything was nice and clean. We had the side bearing blocks were removed. We wanted to make sure all of that debris that was laying in here was gone, because if these were up on the semi-trailer and it was going down Interstate 80 and you know, at you know, 65, 70 mile an hour, we didn't want this stuff blowing off and hitting other vehicles. We didn't want to be liable for any of that either. So everything was ready, and we were ready for the lift. And earlier, previous day, they had cut up some of the overhead cranes, placed them on a flatbed truck, and the truck bed that was going to hold the frame was backed up underneath it. First, we didn't quite understand why, but in preparation here, we'll see just quite in soon here what's going to happen. And so the lifts began, and I'll tell you what, these guys were really good. The coordination that they had between the crews on the ground and Sam running the crane was just exceptional. You know, a lot of times the crane operator cannot see what's going on the ground, but when the guys use the hand signals, I'll tell you what, the work that they did was just exceptional. So what they had to do now is bring the truck right over on top of the semi and lower it. Now the wheels of the truck assembly themselves could not sit directly on the flatbed. It had to sit on those boards, because there's a thing called a flange on the wheels themselves. So they actually had to sit on the rim of the wheel and not on the flange. And because of these things had sat for so long, they had froze up in the bearings. So you can see, even though one of the wheels is set flat, the other sides are not. So it took them quite a while to kind of get this thing situated just right in order for all the wheels to set down flat and level, because the bearings were so frozen up. Eventually, with a few more hand signals and everything was settled down. Now, before they released the chains from the crane, they had to ensure that this thing was not going to roll. And so everything was chained down to the flatbed first. Once everything was secure, they released the chains, and they were ready to move on to the second lift. Now it became evident why they did what they did. With this truck in place here, and this old crane sitting here on that other semi-truck, they were able to slip this crane with finesse right in between. Because if something happened and this broke loose, you didn't want it rolling off the back here and causing any damage to either the semi-truck, the railroad steam engine truck itself, or any injury to any of the workers. So with Sam up there guiding everything into place, everyone working underneath and all the hand signals, everything was dropping into place. And you could really see the difference now between the bottom of the wheel here and the bottom of this wheel here. You can see how the bearings had everything frozen up in there. Nate puts a little bit of back into it.
Maybe a lot of back.
And there it goes, dropping into place. But maybe not just quite. Because things, you know, they might look good to me or you, but these guys are the experts. Things weren't sitting quite right. They lifted it again, and watch how this gap, look how much it lifts. Little shove, a little more pull here, and next thing you know, it drops right back into place. With everything in place again, everything was good. Sam eyes everything over, and the chains are released. The only thing left to do was to move the brake cylinder and the brake rigging back up on, secure them onto the flatbed, and everything was ready to go. Sam eyes everything over one more time, make sure everything is good, and the truck was ready to depart. Well, except for a couple pictures here, make sure that for posterity's sake, and now we were ready to go. And you know, there was a lot of anxiety through a lot of this. We weren't sure that things were going to happen at all. And it all came into place. The timing was perfect. Within 4 days, from finding out that this was actually even there to happen, we got these trucks saved. It was almost a miracle that all of this came together. And like I said, there was a lot of anxiety. And that truck, it just took right off. Nate said that you weren't gonna really feel that release until the next morning. He says, when we knew for sure that those things were safe in Sugar Creek. And you know, he was kind of right. There was still a lot of this anxiety built up until the next morning. And that next morning came around, and we got this photograph sent to us from the folks over there in Sugar Creek. And there is the tractor trailer rig. There's one of the steam engine trucks here already on the ground. There's another one here on the truck. There's our truck driver. And this is the back shop of the museum. This is a functioning, working shop where they actually rebuild steam locomotives. The big overhead cranes. This is a brand new state-of-the-art facility that repairs these types of equipment. And when we saw that, I'll tell you what, it was a real treat. We were very, very happy and a real relief. Before we go on, Sam Day from DCI is here with his family, and those folks were instrumental in helping buy us some time to make all this happen, and those guys were really great. I'd like to have a round of applause for without them, this wouldn't have happened. This piece of history from the Cooper Bessemer may not have made it to the Age of Steam Museum in Sugar Creek. There was a lot of other information here that I had to actually made it to the cutting room floor. Let's call it. Okay, but so we're going to just move right along here. So there was an opportunity to take some of these extra parts down to Sugar Creek and to see the trucks down there. Unfortunately, Nate set this up, but he couldn't make it that day at the last minute. And so I asked Mike Sly to go along with me, and Mike says, "Oh, no, not really." No, he didn't. He jumped at the chance. Okay, so this is, like I said, this is not only a state-of-the-art, brand new state-of-the-art repair facility, it's a brand new state-of-the-art museum. This is not an old roundhouse. This is a brand new roundhouse built specifically for this museum. And when we got there, we got to meet Tim Sposito. He's the chief mechanical officer at the Age of Steam Roundhouse. And here he is with the tender trucks. First thing he did when he showed them to us is that the trucks had been cleaned of any more debris or any grease. All of that stuff was taken off completely. We looked at both of them carefully. You know, they were in pretty good shape. What we see here are the saddle from where the frame would sit. This is actually part of the brake rigging, and this is the spot where one of the side bearings would sit. And he said that these are going to be stored outside. So what they do is any place that could retain water, first of all, they drill a hole in there to allow that water to drain. And then they use a material to prevent any type of rust from occurring inside any of these pockets that water may retain in. Okay, you know, we got to see, excuse me, let me go back here just a second. Okay, so we got to see that in great detail. We could see one of the trucks here next to a small steam engine wheel, drive wheel, and of course the locomotive in the background, some various parts in the shop. And he said that these are going to be stored outside. When I asked him, well, what are you going to do with these? He said for right now they have no immediate plan. He says anything can happen in the future. They may even use them for possible trade with someone else. You know, we really don't know at this particular point in time. He offered to give us a tour of the place, and of course we said, oh no, that's okay. No, we jumped at the chance too. Okay, and you know, as I said, there's a lot of materials, but we're only going to focus on a couple things. First of all, this engine right here was undergoing a ultrasound inspection for the boiler. This engine was famous for being in the movie Emperor of the North with Lee Marvin and Ernest Borgnine. If you ever get a chance to see that movie, it was from the producers of The Dirty Dozen years ago. Excellent movie. I highly recommend it. One engine I do want to point out that they had in their collection was this U.S. Army Consolidation 280 that was built specifically for the United States Army for use worldwide during the Second World War. This engine is a real star because every Veterans Day they have a celebration there that is a crossover event. They have a couple flat cars that were U.S. Army Transportation Corps cars, and individuals that have private collections and in their collections have military vehicles come down there to celebrate Veterans Day. They ramp them up onto the flat cars, and that steam engine goes on photo run-bys. There's a lot of individuals there to celebrate Veterans Day and dressed up in garb and what have you, and they have quite an event down there, one of their most popular. So when I got home, I began to realize something. I pulled the two images that they have on their website off the internet of the two flat cars that they have, because one of them is really familiar looking. This is the one that was in the Cooper Bessemer. It was a 38,000 series car. Theirs is a 38,000 series car. This is the one that was scrapped. They had the money and the wherewithal. They would have loved to have had this car here. This is one of them things in timing that we missed. If we would have known ahead of time that this thing was going to go to the scrapper, we would have made it well known to these folks down there. They probably would have loved to have had another heavyweight flat car in their collection to go along with what they do down there at Veterans Day, because, well, I'm not going to dwell over spilled milk. So during the tour, we got to see a lot of beautiful locomotives. These are fully restored and operational locomotives. They do a wonderful job for not only themselves, but for other museums and other organizations as well. They also are in the process of restoring other pieces of equipment that come in, like this Reading Camelback 040 switcher. And no, not that kind of camelback. Camelbacks were little engines that the fireboxes were so large in the back that the cabs had to be built over the top. So because they have so many great locomotives in there and so many rare ones under restoration, it soon became evident to me that what you see here in this picture is the most important aspect of that museum. You probably think I'm talking about that big hunk of metal in the middle of the picture, aren't you? No, I'm talking about this big wooden thing here. I don't have to tell you folks here at the Grove City Historical Society how important a roof is to any museum, do I? No, I don't, huh? You know, because especially with pieces of railroad equipment, they're so huge that, you know, no matter what you do to restore them, if you don't keep them under cover, the elements in 10, 20, 30 years are going to wreak havoc on all the good work that you do. And they are extremely fortunate that they have not only a roof, but such a beautiful roof in order to cover all of their equipment. One more thing that I do want to show you is something that Tom Sposito showed Mike and I, is this little beauty right here. This is called a fireless cooker. It didn't have a firebox or a tender for fuel. It was basically a giant thermos bottle. All it did was pull up to a factory's stationary boiler and tap into its steam line, pressurize itself, run around the yard all day. Once it started to lose pressure, it would go back and get some more. And you know what? I bet everyone in here has seen this engine before. It sat in front of Telly's Old Express for years, since 1974. And when Tully's was sold to that truck stop group, and they decided to tear this building down, they, the folks from the Age of Steam acquired it. That was in 2018. They took it to the museum and restored it to its original condition. Unfortunately, that was another one of those instances at Tully's where there was a rare caboose that was inside. Folks like Nate and a few other folks and the folks at Age of Steam were trying to save that caboose. Unfortunately, they were not permitted, and it was destroyed. And so there were other rare pieces that were lost at that point in time. So we were taken outside, and this is a thing that we really wanted to see. This was the tender from the Bessemer Lake Erie Texan that was down in McKees Rocks. It had been moved up to the Age of Steam Museum and put out. It's been restored to a degree, and it has been put in storage out there. Remember I said years ago the Texan had been rebuilt? Well, it was not only rebuilt internally to operate, but it was also cosmetically restored. And for a period of time was exhibited down at Station Square in Pittsburgh. A beautiful looking engine. Unfortunately, the weather stored outside wreaked havoc on it. And right now it is owned by the Age of Steam Museum. They are in the process of moving the boiler section back to Sugar Creek, Ohio. They want to get this thing running again. I hope someday soon we can all get a chance to see a Bessemer Lake Erie steam engine, a big one like this, return to operation. This will be the largest steam locomotive that they have down there. It will dwarf all of the other ones that they have in their collection.
Vince, just an insert a thought here. David P. Morgan, the late editor of Trains Magazine, he knew his stuff. He told me that the 47 Bessemer Lake Erie Texas types were the most powerful two-cylinder steam locomotives anywhere on the planet, ever built.
Ever built.
Right. Now, the Alleghenies and the big boys and whatnot that had extra cylinders, that had 4 cylinders, they were bigger. But this was the largest, most powerful two-cylinder steam. It was even more powerful than the 210-4s, the Texas types that were on the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Chesapeake and Ohio.
And it was
Santa
the
Fe.
Bessemers.
And the Bessemers, and there's one left.
And there's one left, and hopefully we'll get to see it steam soon. So we said goodbye to Tom, and we thanked him for the show that he provided to us in the tour, and we went ahead and moved on. So I did some considerable research, much too much right now to provide to you folks in this particular presentation. because of the time constraints. So, which locomotive did this particular tender frame come from? Well, you know what? First I thought it was from a Mohawk, and from those dates, what I found was the early Mohawks had a much smaller tender. So I went to look at the Mikado class. They too had a small tender. What I did learn was that in 1924, they all got new ones. Even though they were relatively new, the Lima Locomotive Works built 111 replacement tenders for many of the Mohawk class and 122 replacement tenders for all of the Mikado class. So what I'm guessing right now at this point is that the tender frame that was out there in the hog yard was one of these replacement tenders. Now, I have, at this point, do not know if it was from a Mohawk or a Mikado. I am not sure if even it was from one of the rare Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Mikados. I still have some evidence pointing in that direction. I've just talked with first-person accounts. I've viewed actual equipment hardware. I've looked at historical records and equipment drawings. I've looked at books and articles and historical societies, and at this point, I still cannot put my finger on exactly which one it was. So I am still researching, and I believe the key is in that number right there, and I have not found anything that I can say points to which one it is. But I'm going to keep looking, and I'm going to keep searching. Right now, the New York Central Historical Society has some records that are in deep storage in their archives, and I hope at some point in the near future I can gain access to them as a member that I am. So someday I hope that I can find it. What I do know for a fact is that there were some folks that got together that were able to save some stuff from the Cooper Bessemer, some of them steam engine tender frames, with the help of some good friends that made it all possible. But this isn't the first time that a shop flat had been saved from the Cooper Bessemer. The good folks at the Greenville Railroad Park and Museum were also involved in saving a shop flat years ago. In 1998, they acquired one of the shop flats that was an Erie Railroad flat car that was built in 1904. The folks at Trinity Industry, formerly Greenville Steel Car, there's their little logo right here, rebuilt it for them, and then they added on this cover. This can be rented for parties and what have you. And there's also a Cooper logo, Cooper Bessemer logo on the car right down here. If you go up there, there's some other things to be seen. There's a Bessemer Lake Erie caboose and an ore car next to the shop car. And there is also the world's largest steam switching locomotive. This is the Union Railroad 010-2. Also inside the building is the central dispatching console from the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad that would dispatch trains on the entire railroad. A very nice little museum to go ahead and see some Bessemer equipment. Mike Schley and I took a trip up northeast Ohio last year, and we ended up on the Ashtabula, Carson, and Jefferson Railroad, which is adjacent to the Jefferson Historical Society Village. And we see the Jefferson Station here. And we met a gentleman who owns the railroad up there, who is from Mercer County, and he told us to take a walk back on one of their abandoned sidings. They have a former Pennsylvania Railroad flat car that was also a Cooper Bessemer shop flat. So some of these things are kind of still around. I'm keeping track of them and keeping a running tab, and I have started a list which eventually I will provide that information to the Historical Society for their records as well. So how did these shop flats get around in the yard? Well, oftentimes they were pulled around by whirlies, and those are the self-propelled cranes. Now the word whirly is actually a nickname that was given to any crane which is free to rotate 360 degrees while loading or unloading. Not my word, Mr. Webster's. So that's where that comes from. And you know, strangely enough, the first one was steam powered, but in this particular picture we have, from the Historical Society, we have a picture of both of them in the same picture, which was great. The first one was steam powered, and it lasted until sometime in the early 1950s. We really don't know what happened to it. The second one was diesel powered and was purchased sometime in the early 1950s. They kind of worked side by side for quite a period of time And like I said, we're glad to see that there's actually a photograph of both of them together. The diesel one stayed on the property and was sold in 1997. Some company was using it down in Oklahoma. After that, we really don't know what happened to it, but we know that it did end up down in Oklahoma. And the last part of this is moving the Cooper Bessemer's 35-tonner. This happened on August 10th of last year. Finally, a deal was struck between the folks over at Cooper Commons, Tom Noon and Ray Grabowski up at the Lakeshore Railway Historical Society to have a donation of the locomotive to their roster on the museum grounds up there with the rest of their GE equipment. And for the first time in a great many years, the locomotive actually got to see daylight. It was actually put back on the rails and shoved out into the light. And timing, again, was everything. I had to work that night. My train got delayed. I was up all night. And the truck driver that was coming to get this thing was also delayed because remember last year, every road in town was closed. So he had a hard time getting into town. So, or this thing would have been on and gone by the time I got back home. So everything kind of fell right back into place. This gave us a chance to, while I was sitting there, to get a good look at that replacement engine block that was done. It was froze up and couldn't move. We got a chance to look at the air compressor. This was to pump up the air brakes. And it had a air whistle, not a horn. Surprisingly, this actually had a toot to it. And we got to go inside, and it had everything that a normal locomotive operator's cab would have. You know, the throttle and all of the gauges, the battery box. One thing I did notice, it had an aftermarket temperature gauges here. It looked like somebody went to AutoZone and got these. Must have been when they put the replacement engine block in there. For some reason, maybe some of the other temperature gauges inside weren't working properly. These are views out the windows. This is the engineer's view out here. This is what he would see. And we noticed there was a nickname. Somebody put Little Leroy in here. Either that was the operator or that's what they called the locomotive. But Little Leroy was the name scribed on the inside of the cab of the locomotive. Now it was a good thing that this engine was shoved up against the wall because what we found was the builder plate had been blocked and nobody could pull it off. Nobody could take it. It was great because everything else was taken off. There was also a plate on here that was on both sides, and we couldn't figure out quite what was on there. And so the builder plate looked like this. There were actually two tags that also said that it was property of the Cooper Bessemer. And on the builder plate, it also had the date that it was built, March 1956, and a serial number. Said that it was the 70-tonner, and that it was a 235 horsepower engine. And you know, after I started to put this program together, it dawned on me that the plate that was missing on the other side, I had held that plate in my hand. Everybody remember Jack that had the antique shop out in Leesburg next to the schoolhouse shops? He had that plate in his store, and I held it in my hand, and I didn't know what I had, and I didn't buy it. So so once I started to put this program together, it dawned on me. All the little neurons started to fire and came together. And I went out to the schoolhouse and I talked to the folks out there, and they said, well, when they had the auction out there, some people came in and from out of state, paid 3 times as much for just about everything, and they bought everything up. All the local people couldn't touch what they were spending the money on. And so it kind of broke my heart. It is alive and well somewhere out there in someone's collection. Okay, so it's there. The other plate is with the locomotive up in Northeast. But these other 2 plates were kind of a mystery. We had talked about them that day, and we weren't sure exactly what they were. So a couple days later, it finally dawned on me. In my house there downstairs in one of my displays, I had this. I bought it over at Jack's store, thinking it came off of maybe one of their big pieces of equipment. And so when I did a little measuring and a little photoshopping, guess what? It fits. It was from one. It probably came off the whoever took this one and sold it to the antique shop took this one too. And eventually that's in the front of the room here. You can take a look at it. Eventually that will go up to the Lakeshore Museum as well to go along with the engine. So when I let Ray know, he sent me this picture. This is the only known picture that we have of the locomotive in active service over at the Cooper Bessemer. This is from their Historical Society's archives. This was taken sometime between 1950 and the early 1970s. We can see it's still in pretty good shape. The orange is not quite so faded. We see the little radio antenna that it had there, and it's still looking pretty good at work. About to cross Madison Avenue. So now it was time to kind of get everything moving, and we needed to get this thing on the truck. When the flatbed came in, it had this little ramp on it, and then we needed to get that ramp off of the lowboy. So the first thing to do was to get the tractor out of the way. And what we learned was the driver and the gentleman who kind of supervised all of this was the same guy who actually brought the Bessemer Texan tender to its new home out in the Age of Steam Museum. And he was pretty sharp when it came to moving all of this equipment. So the first thing that we had to do here was get this ramp off of the lowboy and get it spotted in place. He had actually done a move the day before for the Lakeshore folks. He had picked up another GE center cab from a power plant in central New York and moved it to them for their collection. So once everything was in place with the ramp, had it all spotted up, you kind of shoved in place. There's Mike over there supervising, making sure that everything's good to go. Gave it a little shove to lock it into place. Now it was time to move the locomotive. Started to rain a little bit off and on that day. And this all didn't happen quite as quick as it first appears in the videos. There was a lot of moving around. We had to make, all the steps had to be just perfect. And because of the rain, it made everything a little bit slippery. You can see it starting up the ramp.
Were the wheels freed up?
Yeah, the wheels were definitely freed up. They moved freely. You can see right there how the ramp was chained onto the trailer. We actually had to move the forklift from the center over to the side in order to avoid the ramp. Now he said we had to move the tongue of the forklift down onto the frame. And we were afraid that the wheels were going to slip down because everything's really started to get wet. Had to give it a little gas. You can see the exhaust coming out of the forklift at this point. Giving it a little oomph to finally get it up on the ramp. Some hand signals from the driver to the operator, getting it in place. And there he is saying just a few more inches, just a few more, almost there, waving them off, and there it is. He takes a chalk to make sure it doesn't roll off. And now it's time for him to chain it down. He was the expert in doing this, because obviously he does it on an almost daily basis.
He's even moved Thomas the tank engine on that trailer.
Once he had it in place, this gave me an opportunity, there I am in my work desk, to inspect, and I didn't know Nate was taking these pictures at the time, to inspect the chain drive underneath. It appears that there was only one traction motor. So the engine block turns a generator, which then provides an electrical current to a motor, which then powers this axle, which then turns the wheels. See the axle, then turns the wheels. But there's only one motor. Normally in a locomotive there are one motor per axle. But in this particular sense, it's like a bicycle. This axle has a sprocket, which then feeds a chain drive to the front axle. Here we see the front axle, or the auxiliary drive, where we see the axle going across here. Oop, we lost the signal, Tom. Oh my goodness. I don't know.
You need a light on?
We need a light on, please. What did we do before?
Push it.
Enter. All right, enter. Will be here.
Hold the plug over there. Hold the EPS drive or EPS cable.
Here we go.
All right.
Okay.
All this history and then modern technology is what goes nowadays.
Hang on just a second here. Let me go back.
This is a nice quick review, Vince, before the quiz.
And you're taking notes. All right. I think that's about where we were at. Okay, so there's the front drive, the front axle. It doesn't like that slide, I guess.
That's where the gremlin resides.
Yeah.
In that
Right
slide.
back on the light.
All right.
Just pull the USB out and plug it back.
Can you see? Let me turn the light up.
All right, and we're just going to go from here. Well, we're going to miss the just a little something here. So we're just, go ahead and turn it out. We'll just go from here. So basically what you're missing is the actual loading of putting the trailer back together and the locomotive going through the factory for the very last time. Once the thing got back out to the other side, Nate had made a very good comment. This is you're getting to see a locomotive shipped finally from for the last time out of the Cooper factory here, the shipping department. Now, as I said earlier, most of the roads were closed last year around Grove City. So, it was kind of like, well, gee, how is this guy going to get this thing out of here? Harvard Street was closed, Center Street was closed, Center Street Extension was closed. The Flatiron Building was tore down. They closed Wolf Creek Bridge. We were wondering, how is this guy going to get this out of here? And when we talked to him, he says, well, I'm just going to back up. And he backed this thing up Princeton Street like so fast. He had a couple trucks flagging for him, and next thing you know, there he was going right down Princeton, shoving it right down the street. I would have never expected this to happen, that it was going to go by Doris's house.
Yep. I wonder what it was.
And of course I had to get a shot of it going by the sign Bessemer, and there it goes, right by the Kolk's house. and before you know it, it was going by Woodland, and there's Doris's house right there on the left, just outside of the view, and right down. So they stopped right down at Barkeyville Road because Nate had to get out and stop traffic. A storm was coming, and they had to actually shove across into the ball field a little bit out on Barkeyville Road before they went ahead, and their plan was then to go east on 208 to Harrisville, turn north on 8 up to 80, go west on 80 to 79, where then they would go up towards Erie, get on 90, and head 90 east to eventually make it to the new home at Northeast PA. Unfortunately, they didn't have time to stop at Foster's to pick up any beer for the ride. You know, but it was well on its way. The next morning, it did arrive at there that night, but the next morning they went ahead at the museum and unloaded it. Of course, there's our driver getting everything in place, ready to go. They took it off the trailer, and it was set aside there for a point in time next to their very, very old Lakeshore, Michigan Southern freight house, which has been got a new basement and a new foundation this recently. Earlier this spring, Mike Schley and I stopped up there on our way back from Buffalo. We saw that the engine has been stored there, is on display statically within the museum grounds. The builder plate ID tags have been removed for safe storage inside the museum to keep them safe from vandals at this point in time. According to Ray Grabowski up there at the museum, that they went in and tried to move the engine block to try to get the thing to crank to see what was wrong, and it is frozen stiff. They too cannot figure out right now what is wrong with it. He says that it probably never ran. The gaskets are really, really clean, and you can still read the Cummings information right on the gaskets. So, you know, until they can get it out of there and get it looked at, you know, he'd like to get it back into service because it is heavy enough. He wants to use this to move around the equipment at the museum because the other locomotive switchers that they have are too light, because they have a lot of very large locomotives that are not operating, that need to be moved around from time to time on the museum grounds. You know, and so here's some of the crew here, including a gentleman who couldn't make it tonight, Brian Hartle from Harrisville, who was running one of the chase trucks up to Northeast. We were very happy to see that this locomotive from the Cooper Bessemer here in Grove City was saved at a museum for posterity's sake.
The motorists on I-79 and I-90 were really happy to see that he didn't back that truck all the way to Northeast.
Oh yeah, I bet they were. I bet they were. You know,
although I think he might have gone faster in reverse. He was good.
He was good. He was really, really good. So in the second part of this series, we got to see saving the steam locomotive tender trucks. And to the Age of Steam Museum, we talked a little bit about some of the shop flats that were saved and the whirly cranes that were over there. And we also got to see, well, except for the very one part there with the Gremlins, moving the General Electric 35 tonner. You know, this couldn't have been done without having a certain shout out to some people, like the folks here at the Grove City Historical Society and Kathy Jack. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to come here and give this presentation to you and help making this possible to have this information put out there. I'd like to thank the Age of Steam Roundhouse, Tim Sposito, for taking those trucks in and for giving them a home. The folks at Lakeshore Railway Museum, especially Ray Grabowski and Brian Hartle, for giving that locomotive a home up there as well. Also, Sam Day and all the folks at DCI who bought us some time and who were so cooperative in helping us save those trucks. There were so many other folks involved with his team there too that I don't have everyone's name, but a shout out goes to all of them also. Nate Clark and Mike Schley, my friends, thank you always for all that you do and all your cooperation. My new friends Richard Bosch and Tom Gerbroch, multitude of others who helped provide information and make this possible, especially my wife Renee, who put up with me during everything that I was doing when I was putting this thing together. Thank you, dear. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got one. The Bessemer, whoever the Cooper Bessemer is now, do they have any other photos of the Whirlies?
Mike, do they have any photos of the Whirlies from down,
I never
down
took
in?
any, I never saw any, and would be really neat, but sorry.
Yeah, so I guess the only ones are the ones the overhead that we have are the two together, and the one that I have that we know of. Same thing with the 35 tonner. Now the second engine that they took in for a period of time to operate over there while this one was down, I believe it was blue. I saw it at a distance, and I believe it was blue, and it was a 25 tonner?
I thought it was a
45 tonner? Yeah,
with 2 trucks.
2 trucks. Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was just leased for that purpose.
Mhm. I don't have a photo of that, and I don't know anyone else who does.
Okay,
Vince,
thank
is
you.
this your quote?
Yes.
I love that. I'd like to borrow that for our bridge project.
Oh, okay.
I might add, the 35-ton locomotive model is a fairly rare one. I think there were just a handful of them made. I don't know the exact number. I did hear it a while ago, but this may be the only one still around.
Oh, really?
There are so
Okay.
few of them.
Okay.
And I think Ray had said the same thing. He wasn't aware of any others.
You had the photograph of the Pennsylvania freight car truck on the truck trailer.
Mm-hmm.
Unknown caller.
That is called a Crown Andrews truck. It was a very
That's right.
common Pennsylvania Railroad truck. There would have been thousands of those things in service
Okay.
in years past. And I didn't get a chance to assess whether that was a 70-ton truck. I think it probably was. They were very commonly used under their big four hopper bottom hopper cars, the H21s and the H25s. That literally were just
Very common.
thousands of cars of that design, loaded with Pennsylvania coal and
Would they have been used
limestone.
on? Would they have been used on something that was a shop car here? I mean, like a flat or something.
Well,
like that?
that's undoubtedly why they were on the property, but I don't remember seeing those trucks. But there were, I don't know, there must have been close to a dozen shop flat cars and gondolas here, even in a time when I was employed.
Mhm.
There used to be more activity there because they moved a lot of the foundry material around with those cars as well. But in later years, they were just moving some of the heavy castings and the finished engines.
Any other questions?
Just a couple quick thoughts, Vince. That Age of Steam Roundhouse, I don't know where I've read this, but I've seen it at least once, one place, and been told it by another reliable source. That is the largest wood structure under one wood roof in the world.
Really?
Yeah, they took a Southern Pacific roundhouse plan. They took a set of plans from out in California, and they basically made it even bigger. They half again the size of that one. So it wound up really big.
They really did support their local community because the community there did have brickyards, and the walls and everything in there were made of brick, of the red brick that were done locally.
Yeah.
Right there. So they supported the local community in manufacturing the facilities and all of the other buildings associated with the museum there. It's a lovely museum.
So that wood roof is just amazing. I mean, these folks need a new roof here. Man, whoever did that one, they know wood roofs.
That is a gorgeous facility.
It is.
And so much inside is, you barely did it justice with a few pictures you
Right,
showed.
right. Yeah, I couldn't do it justice.
There
just
are
to
so
see.
many well-done displays in there and really interesting and unique pieces of equipment. And then, of course, outside there's quite a bit to be seen. And it's a pretty nice part of Ohio to visit, too.
Yeah, beautiful. It's a very authentic looking building. I mean, it looks like it's original. and
Yes.
yet it's not.
Yes, it's not.
The other point I was going to share, you showed the military train with the flat cars and the equipment that they, people that own these half tracks and whatnot bring in, and they put them up on the rail cars and they chain them down just the way they did. My youngest son, who is an Army combat medic and was actually, performing procedures on people while he was at Fort Irwin, California, near Death Valley. This past entire month, they went 28 days without a shower. He was also the same hands that were working in people's bodies that got injured, smashed a hand or that kind of thing. He was tying down his FLA, which is a field litter ambulance. It's basically an upfitted Humvee that's got an ambulance built onto the back of it. He actually, at Fort Bliss, Texas, was out there underneath, up underneath laying on his back on the flat cars, putting the chains on, tying them, ratcheting them down, and all that stuff.
On the cars.
And they took it out to Yermo, California. Got all there were 3 entire trainloads, tanks, everything, because he's with a tank battalion. So, but he got to be up on the rail cars and doing all that stuff. And I told him, I said, flat car is about the most dangerous car to get on and off, because when you get up, there's nothing to hold on to. So they're real easy to fall off.
Very easy to fall.
And he told me, he says, every time I go up on those rail cars, Dad, I think of what you told me.
We were really lucky that we saw this, and within a few days, thanks to Nate making a few phone calls, and that all of this came together when it did, and we were able to save this within a few days. That it all happened when it did, because you can see we were a couple days late for those flat cars that could have went to that museum.
Yep.
And you never.
Did you want to test some?
Oh yeah, well, you never know just by sending someone an email or seeing something and taking a picture of it or letting someone else know how that might affect the future and how that might be able to save something for a historical society, for a museum, or for the future. You never know how things might play out.
Think of the story. Go ahead. No.
Because if it wasn't for just doing that, I wouldn't be here sharing all of this information with you right now and bringing us all together.
And when you look at all the different things on the 3 floors in this building, there's a story with every one of those pieces and how it is still here
Absolutely
today
right.
instead of in a landfill.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And there are millions of stories that were missed and are in landfills right now today.
Or got melted down and recycled.
Melted down.
And we drove here in them.
That's right. Speaking of things that we don't know about, we still don't know about that top secret ingredient that's in that punch that's sitting over there. So please feel free to help yourselves.
Right out there for you
There's
to
plenty
see
of
there.
cookies over there.